We think. We process. We create. We are psychologists, studying human behavior and the brain. We discover. We research. We push the limits to learn new things about ourselves. We are one, and together, we are the world. We enter ancient Greece approximately 400 BCE, where history is being made. Socrates and his student Plato are intensely thinking. Even before the time of psychology, philosophers like him study the connection between body and mind. He has deduced, after careful agonizing consideration, that knowledge is intrinsic, but there are some who disagree. Aristotle, a student of Plato, says knowledge comes from experience. Descartes, a French philosopher, says mind and body are separate and that animal spirits would have the mind communicated with the body. Francis Bacon, a trailblazer for modern psychology, held the idea that psychology should not be studied theoretically but experimentally. And finally, John Locke, the man who created empiricism, a scientific method of thinking that focuses on observation. It would transform psychology forever. Enter 1897. Wilhelm Wundt is conducting the first ever psychological experiment with the use of empirical thinking and method, using observation and experiment. But he isn't the only experimental psychologist. There is also Edward Bradford Titchener.
So, in my mind, Titchener represents the creator of structuralism, which is just vital to all our research today. And it is a way to understand the mind by looking at it, and the way it processes stimuli and function, and also with the use of introspection, which is highly valuable tool, though not as popular today.
Out on the other side of the spectrum, William James, the founder of functionalism, looked at why the mind does what it does and how this aids human development. He later wrote The Principles of Psychology, a heavily influential book then and even today. And thus, modern psychology was created with empiricism and experimental psychology, which uses experiments to explore the mind and human behavior. This would eventually lead to B.F. Skinner's theory of behaviorism that states behaviors are learned through conditioning. He would later try to solidify this theory using pigeons, feeding them food at intervals, and watching as they themselves develop strange superstitions. While psychology was established as a science with Wundt's experiment in 1879, it wasn't until the 1920s that it began to have an impact on society, or a sound scientific methodology. Key figures up to then had been philosophers and physicians, but their work showed people the importance of studying the mind despite their own, often unorthodox practices. Sigmund Freud explained much of the mind's inner workings through a theoretical structure of the mind in which there are three parts with different motives, which he deciphered through over 30 years as a therapist. The id wants self-satisfaction regardless of everything else. The superego wants what is morally and socially acceptable, and the ego is the middleman which satisfies both while dealing with reality. When the id wants things that it can't have, it threatens the ego, which is the cause of anxiety. The ego then uses defense mechanisms to keep it in check. In study number 30, the 5 main ones were summarized by his daughter Anna as repression. Block it out, it can still wreak havoc on subconscious, but you don't notice as much. Regression, revert to an earlier state in life, retreat to a childish state of security. Projection, unconsciously place it on the other people instead of self. Reaction formation, obsessively do the opposite to block it off. Sublimation, channel it into something more acceptable. This is the healthy thing to do. Freud's theories boldly explained the mind, but like others of his time, they were discredited for lacking scientific rigor. American psychologists John B. Watson and later B.F. Skinner took psychology in a radically different direction in the 1920s by applying behaviorism. This focused on studying observable behavior and keeping scientific objectivity, rejecting difficult-to-measure practices like introspection. In the 60s, behaviorism was in turn challenged by humanistic psychology, which focused on people fulfilling their inner needs for love and achieving their potential in other situational factors. Throughout the history of psychology and continuing into today, the question that has persisted is what influences us more, our biology or hereditary genetics, or the experiences we've had in the environment we grew up in? Known as the nature versus nurture controversy, this question has been around for centuries. Psychologists across the ages have questioned how much of an effect nature, or genetics, has on who we become. Debated by the ancient Greek philosophers Plato, Aristotle, Locke, and Descartes, only Descartes' take, which qualified that some ideas were indeed innate, is supported today. Backing Descartes were the studies of one Charles Darwin, who proposed the evolutionary process of natural selection. This concept detailed that of all the random genetic variations, nature favors the traits that allow organisms to thrive and grow. In study number 3, Thomas Buchard studied identical twins to discover more about this phenomenon. He measured the traits of adopted twins that had been raised in different environments and then measured those that had been raised together in the same. He found that twins raised apart had some traits with large difference ratios, but found that some traits stayed very similar in separate environments. Psychology has never been confined to the study of the brain or the study of behavior, for the reason that there are different levels of analysis on which psychology is applicable. Different levels of analysis applied together create a biopsychosocial approach, which brings in perspective on the relevance and application of biological, psychological, and sociocultural factors. By exploring different perspectives of the same question or topic, levels of analysis can create new understanding of a situation. Take the concept of anger. Psychologists working from different perspectives might shed light on this phenomenon very differently. A biological perspective might include studying the brain chemicals and circuitry that cause anger in a person. An evolutionary perspective might try to explain how anger helped our ancestors survive and is thus a surviving trait. A psychodynamic perspective might see anger as a manifestation of an unconscious aggression or hostility. A behavioral perspective might look at the external situation to see if stimuli was triggering anger. A cognitive perspective might address it by studying how interpretation varies by individual and how anger can alter cognition. A humanistic perspective might try to address the possibility that anger might affect personal growth. A sociocultural perspective might delve into how anger and its expressions vary from culture to culture. Like any field of study, the field of psychology is divided into all different kinds of subfields, each channeling the power of psychology in order to fertilize the massive diversity of subjects. Psychology is separated into 2 main branches, which splits off into more branches. The research-based branch is both basic research and applied research. Basic research is conducted to expand the foundation of knowledge. Most research consists of biological, developmental, cognitive, educational, personality, and social. For instance, in 1973, Eleanor Rosch did an experiment exploring if humans naturally associate objects to words. She did an experiment using colors and taught color names to an isolated tribal group that only had 2 words for color. She found that humans have a natural perception of color, making it easier to learn, for instance, fire truck red than maroon or blood red. Applied research, on the other hand, focuses on practical problems like researching workplace relationships and issues. The industrial organization psychology focuses on humans, machines, and the physical environment relationship. Other psychology also focuses on the care of patients. For instance, counseling psychologists assist people with problems in life. Clinical psychologists help study and assess people with psychological disorders. And psychiatrists do a combination of both while administering medicine to cope with symptoms from psychological disorders.